I was here 50 years ago today when I was 9 years old for the original dedication ceremony. Right, and it was down there at the Wooster House, and we got there early in the morning. It was a hot day. We're lucky today that it's not as hot, because I remember how hot it was. The sun was shining. It was a big day. We got there early. I remember my mother kind of letting me kind of run around and do whatever I wanted to do. So I went down and spent time in that little creek down there. There's a creek down there by the Wooster House, and I remember a whole lot about that day. But I remember playing in that creek, and I remember there were mussel shells down there. Well, that's the first time I'd ever seen a mussel shell. I didn't know what that was. You know, of course, I told my mama there was something down there that belonged at the seashore. Well, I was almost right. But I remember over years, I remember thinking, well, maybe I didn't really see those mussel shells. Maybe I really didn't know what I was talking about. I went down there today, and sure enough, they're still there. There are mussel shells in that little creek, which tells you how clean that water is, that it's still a wonderful little creek. It means that things have not changed here at New Echota very much. But that was a wonderful day, and it made a big impression on me. Now, I was very lucky to have parents who cared about these kind of things, who thought it was important to show up at events like this, who thought that New Echota was someplace really important that we ought to celebrate. By the way, Jack, my mother was from Oklahoma. My mother was from Ponca City, Oklahoma. And, of course, I visited Stillwater and Oklahoma City and all these places when I was a child, so I didn't think it was a big deal. It was a connection between Calhoun and Oklahoma. I already had that connection through my childhood. But over the years, then New Echota became a real important part of my life and a great influencer on me. Now, let's back up a little bit and let's think about this other context. We've heard about the historic context of the Cherokees here. But, you know, people have been living right here in this area for about 12 or 15,000 years. I mean, can you imagine that? You know, back to 12,000 BC, 10, 11, 12,000 BC. The two rivers come together over here. All of you probably know that. The Conasauga and the Coosawattee and Newtown Creek all come together right over here across the highway. So that means it was like an intersection of major expressways. Think of it that way. Right here, right where we are, and right across the road over here. And the materials that we have found here over there on the banks of those rivers date back 10, 11, 12,000 years. It's unbelievable, and almost continuous occupation during that whole time. So imagine, again, you know, what this was like back then. Let's think about that for a second. At different times, this was a major forest with big trees and vines and all kinds of things. At other times, it was a savanna, meaning an open field, because native people here would burn these fields periodically as a way to grow new crops and also drive animals that were here and to hunt, to do those kinds of things. So the landscape changed a good bit in terms of trees and no trees and all of that over a long, long period of time. That occupation, when you get on up then into what we call the Mississippian period, about over 1100, 1200 AD, then we begin to see these big mound structures, ceremonial structures, and they're here. They're right here on the Coosawattee, not too far away. These big ceremonial centers that were here. And so then when the Cherokees came here in about the mid-1700s, meaning that the Muskogean speaking peoples were here earlier than that, the ones that built the big mounds that were here. And then all of those people disappeared in about a 50-year period, between about 1550 and 1600, after the Spanish came in, after these European diseases. You had these big population collapses. Perhaps 95% of the population disappeared within 50 years. Now, it happened to the Cherokees, too, that were up in North Carolina and Virginia and in those areas, too, decimated by these terrible diseases. And imagine the upheaval that created if all of your family members died and all your political leaders died, or a large number of them. I mean, imagine what happened in that 50-year period. That meant that then North Georgia, and this part of Northwest Georgia, was then abandoned for a good period, from about 1600 to sometime in the mid-1700s, for a long period, 100, 150 years, when the Cherokee peoples that were being essentially decimated too, up in that North Carolina, Virginia area, and threatened, began to move into this part of Georgia. It was a refuge. It was a wonderful place. It was a place to get away from all those other incursions, and nobody else was here. And so it was a wonderful place to live then during that period. But they couldn't get away again from other Europeans that wanted this land. And so terrible things began to happen here as well. So it was a story of great life and of tragedy, of perseverance, keep moving, keep trying to find a way to stay alive, keep things moving, keep progressing in their own way. That's what the Trail of Tears was all about. A sad, sad thing. But as you heard from Jack, look at the great things that have happened in Oklahoma since then. People that have persevered despite all of these terrible things that have happened. And that leads me back to an interesting point. And that is, we think of, a lot of us that are from European type backgrounds, we think of land that is sacred because of death that happens on a land. We think of battlefields as being sacred because people died there. We think of cemeteries as being sacred. But what's interesting among native peoples, they think of places where there is life as being sacred. This is why we wear the color red, where a lot of Indian people wear the color red. It signifies life, sacred fire, these things that give life to things around us. And so native people celebrate death, yes, as being a sacred place, but life perhaps even more. And that's something I think we can all learn from. Notice the proclamation that Jack brought down here. It has a little red ribbon on it, which again signifies that life that is all around us. Now, in the early 1950s, I want to come back to that thought in just a minute. But if you think about this site in the 1950s, as we've all talked about, there wasn't anything here. I mean, people didn't even know that this was where the Capitol belonged. There's a monument up here outside the museum. It's this funny-looking obelisk type monument, cenotaph, I think they call that, that used to sit at the Elks Club across the highway up the road. And I used to hear that it was the smallest national monument in the entire United States, because about the 10 feet square around that little monument, was considered a national monument in the United States, and the smallest one in the United States. And the reason that it was there was to commemorate New Echota and the Cherokees that were here, yes, but nobody really knew where the town was. That's why they put the monument up there on that little hill, because it said somewhere nearby here. They really didn't know the exact location. They knew about the cemetery that was up the road up here, New Echota Cemetery. And what's interesting about that cemetery, it has a rock wall around it. That rock wall was built by a man named Lawrence Hillhouse, who was from Calhoun. He was mayor of Calhoun 7 times, missionary to Africa, 1913 to 1925. He built that rock wall in the 1920s. And my father told me that when he was a scout, a Boy Scout, that he would help Mr. Hillhouse go out there to that cemetery and help trim it up. And he said he had the worst case of poison ivy he's ever had by going out there one day and helping clean up that cemetery. But the point is, people knew some remnants about what was here, but not until the early 1950s, thanks to Mr. Self, John Slagle, some other folks who helped come forward and say, we need to do something about this. We need to find a way to preserve this land. We think this is where it is, about 200 acres. We think it's located in this particular area. We ought to find a way to preserve that. And that's what they did. The cost of that land, the best I could figure out, $18,000 to preserve that 200 acres. And everybody in town was helping out, contributing $1. $1 per person in the county would help preserve the land. And they had penny drives at the schools and those kind of things to help, a community effort to truly preserve this land and make something great happen here. Finally, they were able to do that, preserve the land. They had Clemens DeBayou, the archaeologist from Augusta, came here, and he had with him Dr. Joseph Caldwell, who was a wonderful man who taught me at the University of Georgia. He died in 1973, and I worked with him on his last archaeology project up near Lookout Mountain. But Joe Caldwell told me that when he was here doing the archaeology work here in 1954, 53, that they were working over here where the well was and around the print shop and those kind of things, and they had not found any evidence of the print shop. They knew it was somewhere close by, but they hadn't found anything. And they were digging out the well, and they were using these WPA workers, people that were being paid $1 or $2 or $3 a day to help out as part of a work progress administration project. And that one of the men came running out from working the well and found a piece of the print, the typeface from out of the old type from the print shop. And it was in the well, down in that well that they were excavating. Joe Collins said, he said, I got so excited. I said, all right, I'll tell you what, I'll give you a pack of cigarettes for every piece of that print type that you find. And Joe said, uh-oh, I didn't know what was going to happen. All the print type started coming out of the well. That's where they found all the print type. He said, I almost went broke on cigarettes, for these guys. But that's a true story of what happened here, trying to find what was here. As David said, this was a land. Had been crops. It had been corn and soybeans and cotton for a long period of time. When I started coming here to work as doing archaeology work, it was in 1969. And they were building the golf course across the street over here, across the highway. And so I was working with some archaeologists, and we were rushing around and finding a few materials over there. There were much earlier materials. But over here, we were doing little bitty excavation things right out on this kind of dirt here, and there was absolutely nothing that you could find. It was just the red clay there, and occasionally find a little fragment. Very difficult archaeology. But that's what we found within significant things around where these buildings were, in the old cellars and in the wells, those places where a lot of the material had been dumped. Well, out of that experience for me, and they wouldn't let me, the archaeologists who were here thought I was just some 16-year-old kid they need to get rid of. You know, we don't need that kid around here. He's going to be looting something. You know, he's going to be after the artifacts, and that's a terror. We can't have him, you know, helping out too much. So they tried to run me off, and one of the ways they tried to run me off was say, well, we'll go over here and we'll give you this round-ended shovel. You know, we didn't use a square shovel. It's got a round end on it, and it's a round. Go over here and dig that old red clay and make it just as flat as you can make it out there. They knew there wasn't anything there that I could mess up. I spent 3 or 4 days, had blisters all over my hand. They couldn't run me off. You know, I still was going to stay there and try to help them. Well, then they left. They had to go back to the University of Missouri and University of Kansas, places they were, and they left that whole field over there. And the bulldozers were supposed to come back in about 2 weeks. So they said, okay, just find whatever. They finally figured out, okay, well, he knows how to map things in now. And he knows how to put them in a bag, and he knows how to label that stuff. But he still probably can't hurt anything much.